Hi, everybody. So, my name is Siera in case you haven't seen a post that my introduction post yet. And I am an intuitive holistic strategist, which means that I work with people as a business consultant. And it also means that, which I've done for 20 years, and it also means that I do not believe that I can address just what's happening in your business without addressing what's happening with you. And so today's talk is all about growing from the grief. And one of the things that is unique to me is the fact that I had gone back to school for holistic health and counseling and have continued on to get a certification in grief facilitation specifically. The reason why is because through my own personal healing journey, through therapy and all the other things, I came to realize how deeply we all experience grief and how grief is kind of like the silent suffocator in our lives. If any of you are familiar at all, in the Northeast, we have radon, and they always say radon is the silent killer because there's basically no recognition that we are in a grief. Like, it doesn't typically make us ill, which we'll talk about how it does present in the body, but it's oftentimes something that is manifesting, that is building up, that is occurring long over periods of time, and it's creating havoc in our lives anyway. And more importantly, specifically, it's creating havoc in our businesses. So today, to kick things off, I want to talk a little bit about where are these places that grief comes from. We so often think that grief comes from somebody dying. And interestingly, as I just mentioned, part of this journey in my own healing and my own growth personally was coming to realize that I had this deep grief that I was carrying in myself, into my life, into my business for things that I was grieving. And it was not the death of someone, it was the experience of my childhood and coming into terms of forgiving and healing from the relationship that I had with my mother and with my father. I had to grieve that I had been holding onto an idea that was not my literal experience. I've had to grieve divorce, even though the divorce was my idea. I had to grieve the part of me that felt like I had failed at multiple business attempts. Every time I poured my heart and soul into it. And every time you pour your heart and soul into something, and then it is taken away, and this is part of the dynamic around grief, which makes it so impactful, is that it's so beyond our control, usually, almost 100% of the time. It's so beyond anything that we've planned and prepared for. Even when somebody has a long-term illness and you're walking that walk with them through dementia or cancer, we hear this from caregivers and family members all the time. Even though they had been sick for years, even though it had been this long drawn out process and we knew the end was coming, when that day occurs, when that person finally does die, there's this overwhelming surge of this stuff that you just could not have planned for. And so that's exactly what happens to us when we have dreams, when we have careers, when we have financial issues, when we've had childhood experiences, when we've had divorces, when we've had friendships, when we sever ties with our family, when our children grow up. when we find out that we are never going to be able to have children or aren't ever in a position to have children, and we always thought that was something that we wanted to do as a woman. Anytime this thing, this relationship becomes a part of who you think you are, part of your value, part of your worth, and part of your identity, and then it is taken away, you are experiencing some kind of grief. What's really interesting, like I mentioned, is that grief doesn't have like an immediate response that is always recognized. Of course, there's crying. And so a lot of times we think, okay, I've cried, I've gotten it out, I'm done. And maybe that's true for you. The reality of the situation is, though, is that there's a lot of other symptoms of grief, particularly the things that we hold in comparison. The things that happen to us, and we think, oh, but somebody else had a lot worse childhood than I did. Oh, that divorce, my divorce was actually quite amicable. We deny ourselves the space to feel the loss. And so then you are doing nothing but suppressing and repressing that grief in you. I used this example the other day saying it's like a splinter. Yes, it can hurt like hell to get that splinter out. But if you don't, it's going to swell, become more infected. You can end up having to get it amputated, and the damn thing still has to come out anyway. Now it's just going to hurt even more. I want you to think about your grief in that same kind of way. So let's talk about some of the signs that may be an indication for you that grief is somewhere inside, that you are storing some kind of repressed or suppressed grief. So one of the first things is a detachment. Maybe you realize that you have become really detached from your own emotions, that there's a listlessness to life, kind of nothing brings you joy anymore. You don't feel as connected to other people, to life, to the hobbies and things that you used to enjoy and love. All of a sudden, it just feels like, nothing. It's kind of a low grade of depression. Maybe you are experiencing what you think is depression, and maybe it is, but it also could be unaddressed grief. And so that's a real thing to look at. Of course, an increase in any of the things that people do to numb their feelings, to forget it, whether it's drinking, shopping, sex, eating, overworking, overworking out, right? The addictions and the numbing tools look different for each one of us. It doesn't make them not real, not something that you're using as a numbing technique, though. So those are a couple things. One of the other things that can be is that you're isolating. You really just don't feel like participating in group events or anything that you used to do. You really don't feel like going out with your friends or being a part of family gatherings or doing something with your kids, grown kids, ever, ever. All of a sudden, you just kind of want to be alone. Another thing, maybe a more obvious thing, is the constant replaying of the breakdown of that situation. The constant replaying of how it failed, how your career ended, the constant replaying of how the relationship ended, in a death situation, and maybe constantly thinking that you should have done more. You could have done more. You should have spent more time with them. Why weren't you there the last day? But it's incessant. It's repeating over and over and over again. So that really obsessive thinking, the thing that as soon as you are quiet, because that's another symptom, some people isolate. Other people are constantly overstimulating themselves. They can't stand being alone. And part of that becomes because they don't want to feel what they need to feel. It's always funny to me because I hear so many people, even when I talk to other professionals and participate in groups and things. One of the things that I hear all the time is so many people, particularly business owners, executives, people that are considered to be successful and have it all together in life, they're afraid to start letting themselves feel anything because they're afraid that once they do, they're going to lose control and they're not going to be able to get themselves back under control again. I'm here to tell you that's not really what's going to happen. I promise. You're absolutely going to be able to get it together and move forward. But one of the important things, and hopefully one of the things that we can take away from this talk then is the idea that this processing of grief is going to allow you space to really start to reconsider who it is, what you want, what your purpose is, what really feeds you. Who are you? Because the self-discovery piece that can come out of truly processing grief, that can truly come from these occurrences of loss and a loss of who we had attached our identity to is really important. And it can be the most beautiful gift that helps you grow. I want to just talk real quickly about some of the ways that grief physically manifests in the body. One of the interesting things is that was actually part of the reason why I got involved in grief work specifically, besides being a medium. And so knowing that I had the ability to be able to connect people with their loved ones that had crossed over. So I wanted to better understand what those clients were going through and what I could do for them to make that experience better. The other part to it was that I had a dear friend who had lost her life and to cancer of the lungs. Very rare form. We were barely 40 years old. We had almost the same birthday. We were barely 40 years old. There was no explanation. It was the kind that was super aggressive, very fast, small cell. And it was only almost entirely attributed to asbestos, and yet they could track no asbestos to her in her life at all. And so one of the things that her and I had discussed prior to her passing was that there was grief, and grief is largely stored in the lungs. And so she always thought part of it was the grief that she had experienced of this life, because this life was just sad to her and it was hard for her. And we were big um, students of all of the different kinds of energetics and Carolyn Miss and all these other wonderful people that have come to help to teach and understand, Louise Hay, of course, that our emotions and what we're feeling are stored and held in the body. And that really was a catalyst for me to go back and even more deeply understand, because I thought, I don't want people dying. I don't want people not knowing and understanding that holding grief in our bodies is one of the most powerful things. And some people attribute it specifically to cancer and lung cancer. And so I went down this journey of understanding grief in a deeper way and making it part of my focus so that I can help relieve people of it, so that I can help people really process and facilitate through. And then I found all these other things along the way, right? So I already mentioned about the lungs. So you may find yourself constantly in respiratory issues. You may find it just harder to breathe. realizing that you're not taking more shallow breaths. Maybe there's even some pain there, repeatedly having issues. Of course, now we have COVID, which, and the respiratory disease, that has become more prevalent in the last few years, but even bronchitis and pneumonia and just people that are constantly having upper respiratory issues and you never really have. Surprise. It could be your grief. The other really largely impacted physical place that is stored in the body is the large intestine. And so any kind of digestive issues, even though we might think of it as stomach, the large intestine is such an important part of our digestive process that it can often cause the nausea. So, and this is not necessarily unusual for people, particularly if they're going through times of loss and transition and stress. But maybe it's exactly the reason why, because there's unprocessed grief there. So loss of appetite, a lot of nausea, like I said, any other kinds of digestive issues are big for that. And of course, if you're replaying these things all the time in your head, and that's definitely one of the things that you can't quite seem to get yourself to move forward, headaches and fatigue. And I know these are kind of vague because they could certainly be associated with all kinds of other things. So again, we're looking for really this combination, did the headaches and the nausea and the loss of appetite start 3 years ago when your divorce began or was finalized, or when the kids left the nest, right? Or when your business partnership fell apart? If there's like this culmination of these things and the timelines all overlap and add up to each other, I want you to consider that this is unprocessed grief. So, how does this show up in other areas of our life and our business specifically, though? And why is this something that I pull into my business consulting and advising? It's because it slows us down energetically. Anytime we are allowing, and because grief is one of the most unrecognized emotions, it's one of the ones that's most least processed. We know when we're angry, right? And you can repress it, and you know that you're repressing it. And so then you find a way to release it. It's harder to identify the grief, though. So this is one of the things that happens with us in our lives, in other relationships, in our money, and in our business, is that when we have these suppressed and repressed emotions, particularly grief, it is taking up energetic space. It is also drawing and pulling the energy from other areas to keep feeding the suppression and the repression. Does that make sense? It's this idea that, like, you've built some kind of makeshift dam for the stream so it doesn't run through your yard. And the more that water over time beats up against it, that starts to break down. And so then you need to start pulling more resources, more rocks, more dirt, more whatever you're using to block that flow, right? To that. And it becomes a time it thing that now you're throwing more time to holding it back. Now you're throwing more physical energy to hold it back. I want you to think of that as the same way with suppressed and repressed emotions, particularly with the grief. It has to draw the resources, the energy, the focus, the love, the attention from other areas of our lives to keep holding it back. And so when all of our energy, I would think most everybody watching this is going to know and understand that wherever our focus goes, that's where the energy flows. Well, then that means that the energy is not in a space where, and even that repression, because when you repress one part of yourself, you're repressing all the parts of yourself. Your very real energetic body, which is science, it's not just woo woo. We can actually measure our electromagnetic fields that come from the heart. Again, not woo woo, true science. That's where the electromagnetic field is generated from in our bodies. And so when you are holding things back and you are taking energy from one place to go to that place to hold it back, then it shrinks your electromagnetic field. It shrinks your energy. Quantum physics, we all give off energy. We're all more energy than we are matter. And so the idea of being able to bring in clients, bring in ideas, bring in business, bring in healthy employees that want to stay, all of that comes from us. We are the root of our business. The business is just an extension of who we are. So whatever is out there in our business that we're recognizing as signs and problems out there are 100% pointing to exactly whatever it is that needs to be taken care of in you. It's directing you, it's showing you that there is something that is coming up that needs to be addressed in you. So in this place, like I said, truly any unprocessed emotions, repressed, denied, ignored emotions in us is going to create this loss of energy and flow to us through our business. So that means it's also stagnating and slowing and constricting the energy to our business. That should make sense to a lot of you here, for sure. One of the other things, as I said, around grief, because the physical connotation is lungs, it's about being able to take a deep breath, right? It's about being able to draw in and push out what never needs to be drawn in and pushed out. And that's a cycle. Same thing with our lives, same thing with our business. So there's a direct understanding and effect to the reciprocity, which is a law, a scientific law and a spiritual law, the law of reciprocity, that is impacted, that is affected, that is constricted, stopped, and stagnated when we have unprocessed grief. So it can perpetuate and often be the root cause to this feeling that you have that you are pouring all of yourself out, that you're doing all the things in life, in your relationships, in your business, and yet you're not getting anything back. Well, there's no space for it to come back. And you have now, again, as I said, interrupted that law of reciprocity. So from an energetic, from a spiritual law perspective, the two biggest ones that are interfered with are the law of attraction and the law of reciprocity. One of the things that doesn't always seem obvious to people is if you are having trouble hiring employees that will stay, or you have started to see your employees leave and you're not getting applications back in, truthfully, a rash of employees leaving should be an indication that something's going on anyway. But having these employee issues are a really great sign because the people that are involved are more easily affected, even in an unconscious way, from stored grief. And it will trigger and highlight and draw out in them whatever form and ways and amount of grief that they are repressing. You know, it goes back to that whole thing of like being able to walk in a room and you can just feel if they were arguing before you walked in or if they were talking about you before they walked in, right? People have this sense and they feel it in you, even if they can't identify what it is or how it is in them or how it's showing up. So I want you to think about the impact then that the grief is having on your business. Of course, all areas of your life. But so many of us make our businesses a priority because that's our income and that's where our purpose is oftentimes. And it's how we feel like we're achieving something, how we feel like we're making a difference for something. So let's talk about some of the ways as we finish up here that we are able to start processing the grief. So one of the first things you have to do is acknowledge it, just like anything else, right? And once we can bring awareness and we can fully acknowledge it and we can accept that that is true for us, that there is something here that I need to process, that we can allow ourselves to go, it doesn't matter that my divorce was amicable. I thought I was going to be married for all of my days, and I wasn't. And I never let myself feel bad about the death of our marriage, the death of the dream and the promise and the standard that I was holding myself to. And so now it's showing up in all these ways. And once we're able to start acknowledging it and we really give it a voice and a place and an understanding, then it helps us to start to actually process. Just like we have to acknowledge whatever feelings it's bringing up. So the second step to that then becomes actually expressing and feeling the feelings. You can't hold them in anymore. And that can be done in all kinds of ways. You know, venting to a dear friend, a sister, somebody like myself, another grief facilitator, a therapist. It can be journaling. It can be, you know, gardening. It can be golfing. It can be running, whatever it is. Excuse me. But you need to be very intentional about the idea that you, whatever practice and form you allow to be, that you are releasing the emotions. Let yourself cry. Let yourself be angry. Let yourself be disappointed. You know, scream, beat into the pillows, go to the rage room, whatever that looks like for you. Create art. Allow yourself to scribble on a piece of paper. Like whatever it is, just be intentional about processing, really feeling and releasing those emotions. Another thing that I think is really important for people to consider, and I kind of started off this talk with this, was the idea of growing from the grief. See, part of why I love, and it sounds terrible in some ways, working with people in grief is because grief does crack us open, even if slightly, even if unconsciously. When we lose some piece of us, some part of us that we were holding as part of our identity, that we were allowing to be part of our motivation, part of our operating system, part of our belief system, and that is gone, it is taken away, or it leaves us, or we leave it, it creates a space. It cracks what you thought was your beliefs and what was yours and your foundations open just a little bit. And it makes us start to question, who am I? Why am I doing this? Do you know how many people I've actually worked with that their business no longer serves them at all after the divorce or whatever the circumstance was? because they came to realize that who they were when they started the business, when it was part of their marriage, when it was part of who they were, that was involved in all that stuff that has now gone away, is no longer who they are. That their lives have now changed. And with it, they have started to question, why do I hold that belief? I never even really figured out or knew what my purpose was. Now I think it's this, right? And so we have to continue to let the things go that need to be let go of. We have to continue and allow for ourselves to make space. So, as part of this moving through the grief, allow it to be curiosity and exploration of what it really means to you. Not just your business, but your relationships or your hair color or the hobbies that you take on, or what does it mean? Why do I go to the same beach every single year? Because maybe you've adopted part of those things as part of the marriage or as part of the parent, and those people aren't here anymore. You're not that person anymore. So allow yourself to really get curious about, have I ever really figured out what my purpose is? What things, if I had to guess, would be my purpose? One of the things that I placed in my guide here in this group, in this container, is a beliefs analysis. Use that. Start to question and see, what beliefs do I hold around these different areas in my life? And then go a step further and explore, where does that come from? What's the first memory that comes up? What's the thing you always heard your grandparents saying around money or around education or around work or our health? Whatever pops into your brain is one of the more driving indicators of exactly where that comes from in you. And so once you write down what those beliefs are and where they've come from, the things, the memories, the experiences that you can relate and tie back to, that's where I formed that belief from. You may then go back through the list again and start to ask yourself, is this really mine? Or did I just pick up a fear and a belief from somebody else? Is this just a belief in something that I tell myself because of experiences that I have had that seem to support and reinforce that? Because now it can be different. So evaluate those beliefs. Excuse me. Evaluate whether your meaning in the certain areas and certain places and ways of your life are the same as they were. Do they still hold true to you? Are they still for you? Or do we need to figure out new ones? So allow this time and part of your grief process to be an exploration of your meaning and your purpose. And the last piece that I think is really important for processing through grief is for you to be able to start some new practices and make an intentional focus every single day around some kind of gratitude and happiness or joy practice. And I know we hear this all the time. And we hear about, starting your day with 3 things you're grateful for, ending the day with 10 things you've been grateful for, right? Keeping a gratitude journal. And sure, it can be all those things. But I also, if that doesn't feel good to you or feels played out to you, which I completely relate to, I would encourage you to find tiny, tiny little ways that you can bring more joy and more happiness, or recognize joy and happiness intentionally into your day every day. That doesn't say beat yourself up if you forgot to do it one day. Or some days we just have really crappy days. And so that might seem like an impossible feat. But if you intentionally seek out to have moments of joy and bring a tiny bit of happiness into your day, it will help to push the grief up. It also, when we're processing grief and focusing on getting rid of the grief, you're creating a void, you're creating a space. So you want to make sure you're putting the right things, the things that are going to feel better back into it. And this is why putting in some kind of joy, happiness, gratitude practice as a daily habit is part of my prescribed grief processing. So I just want to thank you all for tuning in. I hope this really helped. I love talking about grief. I love supporting people in their grief. So if there's any way that I can be a support to you, please don't be afraid to comment, to reach out by direct message. I'm available. I'm here. And I'm happy to have any discussions with anyone. If you think you might be grieving, if you're not sure, you definitely know that you are. Thanks again, everyone. I hope this was great for you. I'd love to hear your feedback, and I'll see you again when I teach the next class next month.